Greetings, Dr. Joseph Martin. Our topic now is bacterial and viral pandemics and cultural karma. Very interesting topic that I'll explain to you how they are connected. It's very important to see the infinite and ultimate cause of pandemics based on emotional, cultural karma and negativity and hatred and murder. Well, just a little bit of background about myself. At the University of Toronto, I did study and have a degree in microbiology, including bacteriology, virology, and some immunology, as well as genetics. And so I've had a lifelong interest in the cultures, if you say, now we're talking about bacterial cultures, of bacteria and viruses and so on, and their epidemiology, their causations, and also their history and how they keep returning in cycles over hundreds and, of course, tens of thousands of years. Now, it's an absolute illusion and lie, as some people might have it in the science world, to suggest that we are past the stage of having these pandemics coming back to us because of vaccinations and other kinds of means of clean water and so on. That is so far from the absolute truth, the actual reality on the earth in plain terms. Now, there is and I'll get to that again in a bit. There is a great book that I've read that you would love. It's won so many awards. It's by John M. Barry, who's one of the greatest authors and historians on the planet. And this book is called The Great Influenza, the epic story of the greatest plague in history. And this is the Spanish flu that was worldwide. It started in 1918 at the end of the First World War and went on for many years through to 1926. It was worldwide. It devastated over 120 million people it killed, and many others that were seriously infected, and of course families of those who died of this influenza. So it affected basically every country on the planet, certainly every continent, and many of the families. John M. Barry's book is a story about how they identified where it started, how it started, and the treatment of influenza. Basically, there isn't any treatment, as you know, because we all get these influenzas, much minor ones. We get them every winter in the cold season, and so there actually is no treatment. Nevertheless, this is important to note. Now, we've had the bubonic plague in the 1600s, which wiped out about a third to a half of all the the population in Europe. And the fact is that we still have a lot of these illnesses now that keep returning. And no matter the advancements that we think we have in science and medical science and treatment and also prevention, it just simply isn't the case. And I'd like to point out the cause. And the cause is the dark age we live in that is still having so much hatred and selfishness and greed and warfare and murder. And I will get to biological and chemical warfare in this video. Now, 1945, at the end of the Second World War, there was another outbreak of influenza that was worldwide as well. It was not as extensive in terms of, as I said, the 120 million that died at the end of the First World War. Nevertheless, it did kill quite a few people, and again, after the Korean War in the 1950s, there was another bout of influenza. So influenza seems to be the major catastrophic pandemic that keeps coming back. However, it's not the only one. We still have now smallpox. We thought we had eradicated it in the 1960s through vaccinations. That is not the case. Typhus, bubonic plague, tuberculosis. Yes, tuberculosis is back again now. There was a slight period in the 1970s to 90s, 1990s, but now we know that the Inuit and the people of the First Nations in northern Canada have tuberculosis, and it's coming back in third world countries as well as the first world countries, even in Europe, where it was a major catastrophe in the 1800s. Malaria and yellow fever are just some of the mosquito-borne illnesses that still are pandemics, mostly in the humid tropical regions of the world, around the equator, worldwide. And of course, these are in places where there's a lot of poverty, hunger, famine, and very poor drinking water. And so we have so many bacteria and parasites that are waterborne, as we call it. That means they exist in water, and we can get it through drinking bad water that have these bacteria and parasites in it. Some of the ones that I'm talking about here are, we all have parasites of some form or other. This is some of the research I've done with my clinical work here in Canada. We all have parasites, and there are ways and means to get rid of the parasites. That's not the topic here. We have so many different kinds of parasites. Some come in food, some come in water, and they do reside in our gut, in our intestinal system, and in fact in other parts, including our brain, our lungs, and other organs as well. We have nematodes, we have spirochetes, we have flukes, we have roundworms, and cryptosporidium and giardia, which are caused from beavers. In fact, we have that in Canada still. And these illnesses are ravaging the people of the world, particularly the poor people and the children who don't have enough food to eat, and their immune systems are very low and poor. And they can't fight off these kinds of illnesses. We have salmonella, which has been a major issue here in Canada through the sale of beef cattle that had salmonella, and many times hundreds of thousands of dollars of meat has to be taken off the shelf. We have dysentery, which creates a lot of diarrhea and eventually dehydration and death. And it goes on and on and on. But another one I'd like to point out is Escherichia coli, or better known as E. coli. Now, we all have healthy E. coli in our guts or in our intestines to help us digest food. But the fact is that there are different kinds of strains that are mutating more and more now as time has gone on in the last 30 years. So we've had outbreaks of very powerfully negative E. coli that have actually killed a few people, a few dozen people in Ontario, Canada, and also in Alberta and British Columbia. And you see, what I'm trying to say, that there's a purpose or cause behind all this, and no amount of medical dealing of the symptoms is going to stop these illnesses, these bacteria and viruses and parasites and spirochetes. What the cause is we need to do some really deep healing of ourself with our spirits, our minds, our emotions, and our bodies, and how we treat each other. We need to be treating each other in a respectful, kind, powerfully peaceful way, with peace and righteousness. And then we'll see that this syncretic kind of symbiotic attitude of the bacteria that we're meant to be in a healthy relationship with will evolve back into a much more kind of symbiotic, positive relationship with ourselves. Now, I know my professors used to say our physical bodies are just bags of microorganisms, and that is in fact the case. We have hundreds of millions of different not varieties, but we have quite a few varieties of microorganisms in our bodies at all times. But we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these bacteria, not only in our gut, but throughout our whole body and organs and brain, in fact. So we need to be in a peaceful co-relationship that's healthy for them and for us as individuals within our bodies. But it's also, what I'm trying to get out here is that there's a karma here, the way we treat one another. And that the way that we treat one another lowers our immune capacity, but it also brings on, at the end of great wars, it brings on devastation from all the sadness and grief and the fear and the terror and dread that this will happen again. And of course, all the anger and rage and the outrage of these kinds of wars. Now, not to say that only, but we know that why did these things happen right after the First World War? Although there's a bit of a history that the chemical warfare had been used in previous centuries, the First World War was the first time that it consciously had used a lot of mustard gas to kill soldiers on either sides as well. This chemical warfare of the mustard gas, which is basically chlorine, which is very deadly, and it constricts the lungs and you just foam to death inside you. It's not the only time, of course. We still have nerve gas. Sarin is used. It's been used in Japan in the raids on the subways, and sarin gas has been used by Syria and Iraq and other countries in the Middle East, and it's also been used by other Western countries in terms of modern warfare. This different nerve agents, including Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam War and also actually used on some of our own troops here in New Brunswick to test it out back in a few decades ago. And then we have biological warfare. So we do know, for instance, through some of the means we have available to us, that the SARS outbreak, the AIDS virus, and the Ebola virus, these are all viruses, by the way, were made in laboratories in America and other countries as well, and have been spread intentionally to create illness in different countries, particularly in Africa and also in the Middle East. So biological warfare of these natures, and these are just a few, three that I've mentioned, 3 or 4, has been used extensively over the last 100 years in international warfare. And as I'm speaking now, of course, we know that there's a big Ebola outbreak in Western Africa involving at least 5 nations, and now it's spread to Britain and America and other Western countries. So, having said all this, and also pointing out the fact that statistically, illnesses that we thought we'd conquered have come back again, like polio and TB and many others, and absolutely no kind of vaccine that works actually for influenza, and particularly the more virulent forms of it, like the SARS outbreak. And we also have other things like hepatitis A, which is increasing in its prevalence worldwide. Now, I'd like to point out that Paramahansa Yogananda, in his many lovely books, and you eventually want to read them all, but you can start with Autobiography of a Yogi, Whispers from Eternity, and there are many others, as I've mentioned. I think the most advanced book ever written is by Yogananda. Yes, I mean the most advanced book on the planet. The Second Coming of the Christ Consciousness, which is an explanation, commentary of Jesus' sayings in all of the New Testament, but particularly the Sermon on the Mount. But it's very, very extensive. 2 volumes, it's about this wide. Yogananda made a comment that struck me when I was in my 20s. And I did read this and had it confirmed by other people that I know. And that is that the causes of all illness that are bacterial and viral are karmic. They're culturally karmic. We know in the history of warfare, which is another thing I have been researching for quite a few decades now, going back to the Greeks and the Romans and all the way through certainly the last 500 years of colonization of the European nations of the rest of the world and the First Nations, indigenous peoples of the world, we know that we can trace the absolute cause and effect. We're looking at universal laws here, cause and effect of warfare and murder and raping and pillaging and stealing of resources and so on, and burning of towns and villages and destruction and genocide of whole peoples and ethnic groups and nations. We can look at that extensively over 500 years and draw out a map of when that happened, and then during and immediately subsequent to that, the outbreak of all these illnesses that cause great death. Particularly, we can start back in the 1600s with the bubonic plague, which actually there were a couple of them. But we can trace out other ones all the way through the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and now into the 21st century. We need to make a direct link in our conscience and our consciousness between the way we treat other people, individuals, nations, ethnic groups, religions, colors, creeds, and sexual orientations, that the more hateful we are with other groups, the more we can be assured that there will be a concomitant outbreak of very serious, deathly, genocidal, bacterial and viral and parasitical illnesses that cause death. The cultural karma, the emotional pain and suffering that is released during warfare and murder and holocausts causes the psyche of the mind and the emotions and the unconscious and the physical body to be depleted to such extent that, say, with the great outbreak of the influenza Spanish flu in 1918, that this has caused the death of, as I said, over 120 million people. When you read John M. Barry's book, you will see that it's far more many millions of people died than the World Health Organization has so far suggested, or any of the other documentations. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that the way to obviously change this and transform this is to bring more light into life, light to your spirit, light to your heart, more conscience to our minds and our emotions, more peace and more empowerment and more self-confidence and self-worth and more respect to ourselves and more respect to other people, other nations, ethnic groups, other religions, and realize that there's a unity. We're all sisters and brothers here on the planet. Only and unless and until we all see that we're sisters and brothers in one great unified family, a United States of the peoples of the world, the sisters and brothers, then I think these illnesses and pandemics will slow down and, God willing, eventually stop altogether. We'll be creating not only a healing symbiotic kind of fellowship or communality with one another as individuals, as two-legged humans, but all the animals and all the bacteria and viruses will be much more healthfully symbiotic with us and support us in living true-hearted lives. Having said this, just in closing, I'd like to suggest you go back and look at my video on the Mahakranti, which is an important kind of estimation of how this will all unfold in the next few years and decades in this planet here beyond 2014. Well, I hope this has been inspirational and educational for you and inspiring us all individually and collectively to become better people, more good-hearted, peaceful, empowered people. That's the reason for sharing this. We can take action, we can change ourselves, we can change history. Be the love we are, and you can be the love you are, and I can see the great light inside you. So enjoy this experience and adventure of becoming all the healthy, loving, light-filled person and soul you already are. All my love and blessings, Dr. Joseph Martin. Namaste. Om Namah Shivaya.